right, so in this video, we are looking at the Age of Reform. We're continuing our look at the Age of Reform, and we are talking about the women's rights movement. And we're going to talk about kind of some of the key figures in the women's rights movement, what life was like at that time, what the roles for women were, and then what they were really fighting for and hoping to gain in the 19th century. So if we want to understand the women's rights movement and we want to understand what was going on and what was really being fought for at this time, it's really helpful for us to understand just life in the 1800s, a little bit about life in the 1800s. We need to recognize that over 70% throughout the entire 1800s, over 70% of families and people lived on farms and worked on farms. And so rural life was the majority of the way people lived. Now, it's not a steady 70% that whole time. It was much higher than that, closer to the early part of the 1800s. Later in the 1800s, it changes. The percentages change, but we've still got a vast majority of people living in the rural setting, not in cities, and living and working on farms. And when your family is a farming family, it's the work of the family. The family farm is the work of the family. Now, the jobs that people have would have been different, and women's jobs were primarily cooking, cleaning, raising children, doing things like that. But if there's a time when something has to be done and it's got to get done now because there's a storm coming or there's some kind of problem, everybody in the family is going to join in to get that crop in or do whatever it is that needs to be done to make that farm a success. So most men and women worked at the home still. That's something we don't recognize and realize, is that both men and women worked from the home in the 1800s. And we don't see most men even leaving the home until much later. Now, even though we don't necessarily see that, a great deal happening, men did have more options, far more options than women did. And so these are the things that if they want to make a change for women, as we said, the first change that's going to have to happen is that women are going to need to gain the right to vote. And that's going to be Susan B. Anthony's lifelong work. Okay, so as we continue our look at the women's rights movement and women in the 1800s, let's talk about Susan B. Anthony, and let's talk about what it was like at that time. So in this day and age, at this time, people did not view women the same way they view women today. The view of what women's roles should be was very different than it is. Women were not allowed to serve on juries, they were not allowed to vote, and Susan B. Anthony really fought for those rights. And she recognized, and the women's movement recognized, hey, if we're going to fight for these other rights, the first right that we really have got to gain is this right to vote. Because without the right to vote, who's going to listen to us? Who's in power? Who makes the laws? Men make the laws. And so if women don't gain the right to vote, then why would the people that are in office ever listen to women when they're trying to fight for changes to laws? An example of the law, in many states, in many places, women, if they had a job outside of the home, which was rare, but if they did, any money that they made was the property of their husbands. And so they would have to turn their money over to their husbands. And so if they're going to make a change there, well, the only way that will happen is if women gain the right to vote, because people aren't going to listen to the lawmakers, the legislators aren't going to listen to somebody that's not somebody that they're representing. And if women aren't getting the right to vote, they're not being represented. And so that's the women's rights movement. That's kind of what the big idea here. That's what they're really fighting for, what they're really hoping to gain. It really looks at what it is that women are hoping to gain during this time. What is it that they hope to gain, and how do they hope to make a change for their lives and the lives of women? All right, so the Seneca Falls Convention is a women's rights convention organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it's a fairly small convention, mostly people locally in the area. This is Seneca Falls, New York, arguing for and basically organizing for the purpose of women's rights. And the big right that they're fighting for, as we've talked about, is women's right to vote, the women's suffrage. This was the first meeting for women's rights, And at this convention, they write the Declaration of Sentiments, which asks for women to be treated the same as men and to have the right to vote. And this Declaration of Sentiments is modeled after the Declaration of Independence with a few key changes. And you can imagine, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. You better believe it, that all men and women are created equal. And so this is a pivotal moment because we're seeing a lot of organization come together to make this happen. Now, it's not going to happen yet. It's 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. Women don't gain the right to vote till 1920. But it is at this time that we start to see so many people really starting to ramp up this idea that women should have the right to vote. So let's talk about Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a powerful advocate for the women's rights movement. She was a former slave. She was an abolitionist. She, like so many of the other leaders of the women's rights movement, gained experience in advocating for a cause, in leading a cause during with the abolitionist movement and with the temperance movement. And so women recognized, listen, we can do things about temperance, about the problems with alcohol. We can fight for the ending of slavery. If we can do these things, why shouldn't we have political rights? Why shouldn't we have the right to vote? And so they began fighting for these things as well. And so we see all these reforms coming about during this time, and women really taking a leadership role in many of these. Sojourner Truth, probably gains her biggest moment in the women's rights movement is in 1851 when she gives a speech called Ain't I a Woman? And in this speech, she challenges the notions of racial and gender inferiority. She really advocates for, listen, look how strong I am. Look how powerful my shoulders are. If I've got that kind of power, why shouldn't I have political power? Look, I can stand and give these speeches. I can advocate for my rights. Why shouldn't women have the right to vote? And she does this in a powerful way in speech after speech all across the country. Her and Frederick Douglass actually have a disagreement. So Sojourner Truth believed and fought for the suffrage for formerly enslaved men and women. So first you got to, give men and women the right to vote in slavery, but then if they've gained freedom one way or another, however, if anybody that was formerly a slave should have the right to vote, both men and women. And Frederick Douglass says, no, that's too much to ask. We should just work on the men gaining the right to vote first. And now that doesn't mean they were enemies or anything like that, but there was a difference there. And so we see, and throughout this whole movement, we see women taking the lead in the right to vote and in gaining other political rights and changing really the way women are viewed in American society.